I'm Peter Dast. I'm Steven's brother. I'm one of the other Sanity Testers on GameCrafter. I'm going to talk a little bit about editing rules today. Is that rules for editing or how to edit rules? It's two different things. Editing rules is an ambiguous title, and that's one of the things we try to get rid of when we're editing a document, is to eliminate ambiguity. There's two major things we look at in editing, and that's style and content. I'll talk a little bit about content first. So the rules need to contain everything you need to know to play the game. Who is playing the game, how the game is played, what the pieces are, how the pieces work together. All that needs to be in there. And as an editor, you need to make sure when you read those rules that you understand completely how the game works, how the game is played, and that everybody else who reads the rules is going to also have that comprehension. So the sequence of information is important. You need to introduce things and then explain what they are. And that's part of what Stephen was talking about with the overview. That gives you an introduction to what the contents are, and then the rules proper will explain each thing that was mentioned in the overview. The rules will explain thoroughly. If you look at those explanations and they don't thoroughly explain something, then that's something the editor needs to point out to the designer and say, hey, you say that this card does this thing, and then you don't explain what that thing is. So what is that? It's part of the editor's responsibility to make sure all that information is in the rules document. If something is explained that wasn't introduced, you need to say, hey, what is this? This just came out of nowhere. You need to keep in mind what the readers know at any given point. So you don't, for instance, the list of components, you don't talk too much about how the auction works. Or how, you don't show the peppers on a Scoville card and say, you get these peppers this way. That's for the rules. If the introduction or the overview has mentioned peppers, we're expecting to see peppers, then you show them on the card, and then you expect that the rules later will explain how you get those peppers, where they come from. So the things need to come in that particular sequence. You asked earlier, somebody in the back asked about how many definitions you should have in your rules. There are just a few things that we can assume that readers will know. There's just basic common English terms, like drawing a card, anybody's going to understand what that is. Rolling a die, that's common knowledge. If there's a weird way or a special circumstance in which the draw takes place or the roll takes place, the rules need to explain that, because we can't assume that if there's a special circumstance. The editor is also looking for clarity in the language. Is everything that's being explained well? If you're using a lot of game terms that are not common English, those do need to be explained, but it's not helpful to use a lot of terms or to make up your own terms for things that are commonly understood. So if you're drawing a card, it's not helpful to say you're delving in the pit. Just keep it as much common English as you can, and try to get rid of overly complex expressions. Try to get rid of strange terms like, gamer slang like buff and nerf don't really belong in rules. They belong in discussions about rules on the online. Rules should have uniformity. The same action, the same item in the game should always be referred to as the same thing. So if you have resources always call them resources. Don't call them goods and resources and treasure interchangeably. Just always call them, pick one term and stick with that throughout the whole set of rules. Voice and tone. There's been a lot of discussion on Facebook groups and elsewhere about second person versus third person. Second person is, on your turn, you do this. Third person is, on a player's turn, they do this. Using the second person and the active voice, on your turn, you do this, is usually a more direct, less wordy way to get a concept across. Write out the words you use when you explain the game to somebody. If the written rules more or less follow that, that's usually going to mean it's clearer and better expressed. The third person becomes a little more important and more useful for you have a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, I run my own RPG in pod, and I use second person for like powers that wait, or features that wait to the player character. But I use third person for terms that wait to creatures in general or like the monsters to character space.
Yeah, it depends. The question is, the example is using second person for player actions and third person for non-player actions and activities. Or just general game rules. Yeah, and that's a useful tool. It really depends on the complexity of the game and what's going on. But for most simple player versus player games, the active second-person voice is usually cleaner. I did run across an example a couple weeks ago where the end game condition was if a player does something, and in that case it had to be third person, because if you do something, well, it's not just me doing something, it's if anybody does it. So that's, again, an editor needs to ferret that out, and any wording that is unclear or can be interpreted in multiple ways, it's the editor's responsibility to find that and make sure it can only be interpreted in one way. Let's make it, I have general proofreading as part of clarity. Make sure everything is spelled correctly, make sure everything is uniformly capitalized and stuff like that. And that's just a matter of having somebody, preferably who's not been involved in the writing of the rules, look at them and find any mistakes. You just need somebody who's very detail-oriented and very familiar with English.
I'll say editors are best. I'll say editors are best.
I'm sorry?
Outside editors are the best.
Yeah, outside editors are the best, yes, because you as the writer of the rules or the designer of the game, you're so intimately involved with the game that you make assumptions about the game that new players are not going to assume or understand or know. So if you get somebody who's not been involved at all in the writing or the designing of the game, they're not going to have any assumptions. They're going to look at the rules as complete new material.
And currently we can't. I work with like a partner on the project, and we can't act as each other's editor.
You can, yeah. If you're working with a partner, certainly if they look at something.
I'll still use the outside editor, and I'll still send my initial playtest version to the editor, while also running playtests, while also running playtests of the game, just in closed environments, just to get a feel.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about blind playtesting. Right here. So that's one of the things the editor is looking for. Does it make sense? Is there wording that is ambiguous? Can you change it so it always makes sense? Blind playtesting is a really important thing, which is where you turn over your game and the rules document to somebody who's never seen the game or a group who's never seen the game before. Ideally, the designer or the rules writer is watching or listening as the players try to figure out the game. And you can learn more about how well your rules are written in 5 minutes of watching people trying to learn the game from the rules than you can in hours and hours and hours of looking at your own rules. And that's a really, really, really essential test of your rules. Can people figure them out without you saying, oh, wait, no, you're supposed to put that piece there, not there. So that's a really essential step. And it doesn't, if you're doing most of your own work, then blind playtesting, listening to that, making notes, and rewriting your rules is essential. A good editor will be able to answer or to solve a lot of problems you would get in blind playtesting before you send it to blind playtesting, but both of those steps are pretty much essential. To learn to be an editor, you need a familiarity with written English, and you get that by reading a lot and well-written material. You're not going to learn good writing by reading game rules, because a lot of game rules really aren't very well written. Read a lot of prose, read a lot of professional prose, well-edited, just regular magazines, National Geographic, Time Magazine, anything that's professionally published, books, good literature, solid nonfiction. The more of that you read, the more you're going to be used to the patterns of proper spoken English, proper written English, the more things are going to jump out at you when they are not correct. Strunk and White, elements of style anybody who wants to read, wants to write, should read Strunk and White. Be familiar with that. The main piece of advice of Strunk and White that everybody should know is omit needless words. Everything that's in your rules should have a reason to be there. It should either be explaining the game world, like in the introduction. It should be explaining how the game works. There shouldn't be a lot of extra stuff in there. A lot of people want to throw some jokes or some humor or some cleverness in their rules. A little bit of that goes a long way, and that's something a good editor is also going to clear out of there. It's like if you're just trying to amuse people, the game is supposed to amuse people. The rules don't need to do that. If you're really into English, there are style manuals, the University of Chicago style manual, the AP style manual. That shows you how words are used correctly. So if you really want to know are these words hyphenated, should numbers be spelled out, or can they just be numerals? A style manual is going to give you that information. I will ask at this point if anybody has questions on general editing, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about sanity tests and that Game Crafter service.
Is there it's hard to say, right, but a time when you feel like you need to have an example, and like how to separate that from the rest of your content?
My slides are poorly edited. The question is when to have an example and how to separate that from your content. There are effectively three different learning modes. There's verbal, there's visual, and there's by example. So in a rules document, you're going to write out a bunch of stuff, and anytime you have a kind of a complex interaction, it's helpful to have an example of it. Either a visual example or a written example. Or even better is to have both, because people learn three different ways, and if you have all three of those things, you get a view from a different direction looking at the same problem. So if the words don't clarify it, the image might, and if both of those don't do it, then the example will. So the answer to that is really, if there's any kind of complex interaction that happens in the game, it should be explained by a written rule, by a diagram, and then by an example. That's something that a lot of the rules sets that we look at in the Game Crafter are missing. They don't have good examples in them, and they frequently don't have good diagrams, because a diagram takes a lot more work to come up with. But Um, a good example, especially one that integrates an edge case or some unusual interaction, can be really helpful in clarifying a slightly obscure rule.
So you do find it useful to, because when I do an example, I always try to find that edge case.
Yeah.
Put it in the example as
Yeah.
opposed to trying to explain it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the level of explanation that a game is going to need really depends on what's in the game and what, how its parts interact, how simple it is. If there's a lot of cards, some rules will include a little section for each card. If that's appropriate, then it should be in there. If it doesn't matter that much, if people can figure it out from the text on the cards, then that's fine. That's fine too. Yes, in the back.
You mentioned earlier on about making wording for different things you might do in a game, like drawing a card or what you call your deck, confusing the players. But there's a game like Netrunner uses a whole sort of vocabulary for how they operate the game. You know, you call your hand your grip, you call your deck your hard ride or your
Yeah.
jazz hand or whatnot. Would you say that there's a good way to do that, or is that sort of just a anomaly example of a game which uses a whole lot of special
Yeah.
language?
The question is there a good way to integrate a specialized vocabulary into a game? It gives a lot of richness and flavor to a game to have everything in the game have its own game term for it, but it also makes the game more difficult to learn. Because when you've played a lot of games, you're used to saying, I draw a card from the deck, I roll a dice, this happens. But if it's, I grip a widget from the stack, then it's like, okay, I have to relearn, half my attention becomes involved in remembering the language of the game rather than remembering the rules of the game or focusing on my strategy for the game. So a big specialized vocabulary becomes an obstacle to comprehension of the game. And if what you want is an immersive experience in the game world, then that specialized language is a bonus. But if what you want is players becoming engaged with the game as a game, then you want to use common English terms as they are frequently understood. And that's becomes a flavor or a style question.
What I found useful around that is when I watch people play, what do they call it, right?
Yeah.
Like, if they read the rules, they're the rule, but if they still call it drawing and putting it in my hand, then might as well have that in there.
Right. Again, that's something that the blind play test will tell you. How do the players actually interact with the game can inform how the rules should be written. Any more questions on that? I guess I can approach this right now. There's just a few thoughts on general writing of rules. The main core of the rules you can approach as writing a computer program or a flow chart. This is going to happen, and this is the order in which it happens. That's the order in which the players should be told. It's going to need to be fleshed out a little bit because players are human beings and they're going to be reading English, not dealing with written code. A legal document are models of the fight against ambiguity, because in a legal document everything is very carefully spelled out who the party of the first part is, who the party of the second part is, what their relationship is. Rules should do that. Ideally, they're not going to be as formal as a legal document because those are very dry and difficult to read and take 3 years of special training to understand. But if you, as a rules writer, if you look at a few legal documents just to see how they use that language and how they try to confront and defeat ambiguity, that can be helpful in writing them. The third thing to keep in mind is to listen to yourself or record yourself and listen to a transcript of that when you teach the game, when you explain it. How do you explain it? What has worked for that? Find somebody who's good at explaining rules. Hang on a sec. Ed back there in the third row has a nice blog post on how to explain games, which is a good start for You read that and you say, well, yeah, this would work for writing rules too. So find somebody who's good at explaining games, listen to them explain your game and take notes while they do it. And then write that up in formal English. Question?
So Paul, just, no matter what you write down, being like interpreted exactly as it's written, just as like, it's a program code will be interpreted exactly as it will be written, no matter what you intend, no matter what you actually intended for it to do. If as a programmer, I've kind of just like transformed like what formulate my words into what will make it like do the best possible example of what what my friend's ideas for the power or feature or rule would do in the game. So just as the computer would do like exactly what you asked for, nothing more. The players would probably do exactly what you asked of them and nothing more. And nothing more. There's a difference between reading as written and reading as intended.
Yeah, if I understand the question, it's that's what you want the players to do when they read the rules, is to play the game as the designer intends. So you don't want to leave a lot of room for interpretation in the rules unless that's part of the game. One of the editor's functions is to remove that ambiguity and to anticipate confusion and questions as they arrive. That's
kind of why I'm certifying laws as someone who plans to be a programmer and has programming experience too.
yeah.
I think there's also value in the blind playtest or the I sit back and watch you playtest, and seeing if your rules are ambiguous and they are doing things you aren't intending for them to do. Watching what players tend to gravitate towards doing, and that might actually be more fun or more enjoyable than what you originally intended.
Well, yeah, just as a designer, you can learn a lot about what your game should be about based on what players do with it, let alone whether they interpret your rules correctly. If they just want to build stacks of things when you wanted them to build lines of things, it may be time to start thinking about, well, maybe I'll make a stacking game instead of a lining up game.
But at that point, like you're saying, you need to tell them to stack them. Right?
Yeah. Well, ideally in a blind play test, you just let what happens, make notes, rewrite the rules, try again later with a different group of subjects. Because if you're having to interrupt, then you've already lost the battle. So, let me see. Any more questions on that? Yes.
Do you find it? There's a lot of times when there's those exceptions, those little, what happens in this very specific situation.
Yeah.
And it gets really wordy if you start throwing that into that general rule set. Do you find it used for kind of like a exceptions section or?
It was on my list somewhere to mention. FAQs should usually be. I don't like to see a set of rules that has a big FAQ section at the end that brings up things that weren't even mentioned in the regular rules. I was like, if people are asking about this a lot, it's because you didn't write the rules correctly in the first place. Get that in where it belongs. Answer that question as it arose. For exceptions, the best place to put exceptions to rules is in an example. If you have a lot of exceptions to rules, then think about changing the rules. Because the best rules, the best games are not going to have a lot of weird edge cases and weird things going on. It's like, it becomes like Fizbin when Kirk was trying to explain it. If A, then B, except on Tuesday, just always if A, then B. But if there is an exception, you can put it in a sidebar, It can be on the card in question or whatever brings up that occasion. But the more exceptions you have, the more difficult the rules become as a whole. So it's best to try to figure out how to eliminate the exceptions rather than writing them in. Yes?
What are your feelings on, sometimes there's these like little thematic sidebars or like random like paragraphs that are like, they've got some cool picture or something. And they're
Theme and
outlined.
flavor and
Yeah, and sometimes they introduce, like I see this, I don't know, 40-50% of the time now, which drives me bonkers. But, where there's stuff in there, there's actual useful information in there, but it's maybe out of place, or
Yeah.
I feel like it's out of place.
Yeah,
But it doesn't really have its own home.
Right.
Besides that, how do you deal with that, or what would you suggest dealing with that?
There should not be any new information should not be introduced in a sidebar, in an aside, in a piece of flavor text.
Okay.
All the rules you need to play the game correctly should be in the main, dry, boring body of text. Anything that's on the side, that's a good place for humor. That's a good place for reminding people that you are playing a code cracking deck or an asteroid mining game, or you're in a dungeon. But none of the sidebars should never introduce new information or information you need to play the game.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on sidebars for examples versus the rules and then the entire example at the end?
I prefer to have examples integrated with the rules. When you explain the rule, have a diagram and an in-game example at the same time that explains that. So you're again looking at the problem from all three directions at the same time. Because if I have to jump around in the rules a lot, I'm going to miss it or I'm going to lose my place. It becomes frustrating. So all the information that pertains to a given aspect of the game should be in one spot. Usually, or a lot of times, you'll see examples picked out by being in italics or on a different color background or something. And that's helpful because it tells people this is a different part of the rules than this part, so I don't have to look at that, but if I do, it's a different thing. You can interject a little more flavor into examples, a little more humor can be there. If they are visually different as well as stylistically different, that's good because it keeps the rules a little more lively.
Because you're saying as long as it's within the main body of text, really. You don't
Well,
have to look at-
Yeah, I want it, when I'm reading rules, when I'm learning a game, I want all the pertinent information about one thing to be in one place. So if it's, where is that combat system? Here, it's right here. I don't want to look in three different places to find an example at the end and a diagram on this page and then the actual rules over here. That's makes it hard to deal with.
Last one, kind of the same thread. Do you have any suggestions for like your routine of writing these rules? Because when you go to like a play test, you don't have the rules in the book size that you're going to be printing it at, and it's not color maybe.
If you're just wanting to do a blind play test and have a set of rules to give to the players, just have what you've written and print it out and hand it to them. The more diagrams and examples, the better. But what you work with is what you have. I'm almost out of time, Stephen. You didn't have a question? I just want a quick talk about sanity tests. Are your rules ready? If you have a good solid set of rules, preferably that somebody other than you has looked at, put them in for a sanity test. I guess I should explain. The sanity test is a service that the game crafter offers where Stephen or I or Dusty look at your rules, we read through them, we try to anticipate any questions a blind playtest group would have in dealing with them, and we try to give you advice on how to not so much how to rephrase this, but here's something we didn't understand, you need to figure out how to rephrase this. We'll also catch to a certain extent grammatical and spelling errors. Our expectations are that you will have close to a complete rule set, not just some sketches and some ideas, which we have seen. Your expectation should be that we're going to sit down and give our attention to your rules as thoroughly as we can. And we're going to give you honest and reasonably blunt feedback. If something doesn't make sense, we're going to tell you it doesn't make sense and you need to fix it. After the test, you should take our suggestions to heart and rewrite your rules. If we have suggested something and you don't change it and you apply for a retest, we're going to be hurt. It will hurt our feelings. You don't want to hurt our feelings. What does your score mean? The scores on sanity tests that I've done have ranged, it's out of 100. They've ranged from 13 to 96. The higher it is, the less ambiguity it is, the less trouble we think people are going to have with it. If you get something like a 13, it means you have an idea for a game, you don't have a rule set. So you need to think about that. And the score is subdivided into a whole bunch of different things. And if we don't give you the median score for a good rule set is 72 to 77. So anything above that, you're in good shape. Anything below that, your rules need a decent amount of work.